Hi, this is Paul. Alex Kaschuta has been sort of at the periphery of the corner for a long time. I know some close TLC watchers have watched her quite a bit in the past. I made a little membership video on the title of her podcast, which is Subversive, and talked about the fact that as Peugeot observed and as Nassim Taleb observed, that if you sort of pitch this as your brand, it doesn't tend to have a big shelf life. There's a ton you could talk about in terms of subversion. But Peugeot's tweet about that, here's the tweet. If you want to build a civilization, you cannot do so on words like dark, rebel, or heterodox. By using these identifiers, you can criticize existing systems effectively, but you will never build anything of value and coherence. So I had that in mind when Algo served up this video, but this video was outstanding. This video was one of the best things that I've seen all week. Now, one of the things that I've been playing around with has been, I haven't quite figured out how to use it yet, but using Notebook LM, because if you there's a faculty where you can just drop the YouTube in, but that doesn't seem to work quite well. So it goes a little bit easier if I drop an MP3 in. It immediately makes a transcript, and then it brings in those AI factors, and so I'm sort of playing around with it to see, whether it's a tool I can use. But I watched this. This is on YouTube, and it's on her podcast RSS feed, which is how I listen to it because it works better in the car that way. But this was just an outstanding conversation with a ton of good stuff in it that is very relevant to a lot of the conversations we're having.
Or, but yeah, I think the relationship between ideology, politics, friendship, loyalty is very strange nowadays, especially given that a lot of this stuff is happening online, and a lot of the expectations are not necessarily about in-person loyalty, but they're loyalty to kind of a more loose group of people. What does it even mean to be loyal? I mean, I'm thinking about this.
One of the things that I've seen recently is that allyship can get problematic very quickly with respect to this loyalty business. And that isn't to undermine the value of loyalty itself, but I sometimes watch people, they want to stand up for someone or against something, and it gets very, in pastoral ministry and in churches, you get very used to dealing with the dynamic of triangulation. Someone will come to you as a minister and say something like, well, pastor, that sermon that you preached, that you shouldn't have preached that because, yeah, I don't have anything against it, but some people are saying yada, yada, yada. And it's like, some people are saying, who's saying? No, I don't want to say their names. Oh, okay. Freddie's calling. Hang on. I've been getting Freddie to text more and more.
Also, in the context of myself, I'm kind of slowly drifting away from what used to be my core place online, and I don't necessarily know how to feel about it because I do have people who are friends, but they're also online friends because I live in like Eastern European backwater. I don't see these people every day. I am loyal to them in some ways, but not in others. Like,
And of course, this is very trying to figure out what's going on in our own little online community. And again, the number of people that participate in this online community, that when we talk about this little corner or these little losers or whatever we want to talk about ourselves, we're very small compared to the number of people, let's say, that will watch a video like this. You only see 10 to 20% of the audience just by looking at what's going on in live streams. And again, when I look at other video platforms, when I look at other channels, you see even less of them because there isn't the encouragement of sort of appearing and looking for friendships or some of the intentionality that we've been working on.
we probably disagree on a lot of things nowadays. So I don't know. What's your relationship to this? If you could speak on this, how do you feel about friends and loyalty and all of this, and especially given what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think in reality, probably people have maybe two, three loyal friends if they're lucky. And I think if you have one loyal friend, then you're already winning. And you can't be friends with that many people, actually.
And does a loyal friend always agree with you? Or does a loyal friend want the best thing for you? And how then does that work in your relationship with that person?
Because there are too many other factors at play, like people's, I don't know, rivalry, envy, status games. Like, these are always going to happen. And, I think in very loose groups that don't have a kind of secure structure or a bond of loyalty, then you're going to end up with people who are quite manipulative, taking advantage. Like, the people who are most kind of psychopathic, if you like, or antisocial, are going to dominate. And lots of people have written about this. If you think about ideas of pathocracy and the idea that kind of antisocial mechanisms come into play, basically, eventually in any group, and like we just see endless destruction of groups or factionalization and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think the point would be to enjoy it while you can, if you like, and just to go back to the Warwick, end of the 90s, early 2000s. It was a very interesting time, even if I was a bit late. I did end up having incredible conversations with people, intellectual relationships with people, including Mark Fisher, but other people too, who no one would ever necessarily hear of, but people who were working on Spinoza and Deleuze and kind of stuff that was much less constrained because it was before the internet. And then when we had kind of blogs, like in the early 2000s, like I had a blog from 2004, and again we were all kind of like emulating Mark, really, but he was so encouraging of everyone, and there was this kind of loose network. And this was a long time before Facebook and Twitter and all those things, which kind of locked down a certain format and certain structure of relating. And then we would meet up in person, so the relationship between online and offline was different. It was, online wasn't the primary thing at all. Hanging out was the primary thing, and online was something you did usually when you were trying to distract yourself from working on your master's thesis or something. So yeah, I think that's changed, and I think online can't be stable enough, right? However wonderful a group you have with people online, it doesn't have the real bonds of face to face.
And this is where I think we are trying to blaze some new ground by stabilizing online relationships and by sort of feeling our way forward to find out how they can be stable, how they can be productive. I'm amazed that what's been going on among a number of us has been going on with us for years now. I expected things to be quite unstable, but in fact, they've been fairly stable.
It can't have that degree of reality attached to it. So it's always going to be kind of loose and
I think about the word that Jordan Hall talked about in terms of scenius. And I think about online versus in person. I was just having a conversation this morning with someone who was telling me that her church, her parents' church, had sort of blown up over such and such a thing. And I was talking to her about, she had been involved in an earlier episode of pretty significant drama in the corner. And it was interesting because I wondered if in some ways I'm always comparing and contrasting the way these relationships go in church and the way they're going online. And then I'm also comparing now with the relationships, let's say, in the estuary context. And there's a certain interesting durability with online, as well as sort of because the points of contact are fewer, you're not getting some of the flashpoints that you do get in real life community. You also don't have some of the ballast that you have in real life community. And when in real life community, like you have a church fight that results in the destruction of the church, that's in many ways way more consequential and way more painful than, let's say, an online breakdown of community.
weak structure, I would say.
Yeah, and yeah, the weakness kind of is embedded in yeah, the fact that it's constantly shifting, and there is, I think, probably just a too big a number of people participating for to have any sort of overview on what's going on, and
And I think, again, part of the fact that the corner tends to be little is helpful here because it keeps it a little bit more manageable.
allegiances shift just as fast as they're formed, and yeah, I think it's also very exciting. You know, it can't.
I also think the fact that our topics tend to be more religious than political because although people certainly do have transformations and do change, people's religious selves are more stable than the political selves, and certainly the religious environment is more stable than the political environment.
Can't mimic in real life scene, but I think it's yeah, it's very fragile as well. The problem with online is that, you know, the more the incentive is to participate, you know, to essentially plug yourself in completely, and that is, I think, to the detriment of your, you know, mental health and your relationship with.
And this, again, has been an issue that we've talked about a lot in terms of how much participation, how do we know? Neil Daedalus has really given a lot of great insight and been very helpful for me when he's reflected on how to evaluate his online participation in terms of his real life commitments and behavior.
With the real world, which really are indispensable. Like, you know, the problem with it is that people who actually win, like you were talking about the pathocracy, the people who win online are also the people who, you know, want to sacrifice the most of themselves to be online all the time.
Mhm.
Because, you know, all these platforms, you said, you know, the structure is now crystalline. It's given, and to participate in it, you have to become, you know, a power user of these platforms. You have to become the most addicted person to Twitter. And that's how you win. That's how you get a lot of subscribers because, you know, you post all the time.
And I think, again, part of what's going on here, too, is that even though Twitter is probably my biggest secondary social media platform, just in terms of participation. For example, I'm also playing around with Twitter, but I think when I think about, let's say in biblical terms, Twitter really matches Proverbs. Short little things, and one of my rules that I've talked about in Twitter is no back and forth. I'm not going to have an argument on Twitter. It's absolutely pointless. But short little things, for the most part, try and stay positive, try and stay true.
The more deranged you are about it, the more people want to watch, and the more you fight with other people also, the more people want to watch. So,
and again, the drama of fighting, of course, grabs attention, but again, I think about this little culture that's developed.
it's yeah, it's just that's the incentives laid out by the platforms, and obviously these are the players who also kind of influence how ideology is digested by the system and how it's presented, and, you know, it's kind of selection effects for the craziest people out there. And yeah, it's tough to participate in if you just want to put your, you know, dip your toe into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think kind of increasingly extreme positions are rewarded by the algorithm, or whatever you want to say, because people have to kind of up the game and
again, if your goal is not to run the algorithm up to get as many subscribers or as followers as possible, you can use these platforms for other things.
up, you know, I don't know, for example, male and female discourse, right? Like, it's the person or the people who say the craziest stuff who get the most attention because it's so unusual, partly, and it generates a lot of pushback or provocation. You know, I've recently deleted my Twitter and Facebook, and I'm only on Substack now, which is fantastic, and I don't miss Twitter or Facebook.
And it was funny because when I saw Substack arise, I thought, oh, look, this is blogging 2.0. And I think it is a far healthier platform. But again, it is just a refinement of blogging, because in many ways, blogging had degenerated into the perverse incentives of the internet. When you look at a site like Pathos, which is just so completely covered with ads, it's like, I don't care how good this thing is. I'm gonna figure out a way to strip all these ads from it before I subject my eyeballs to this thing. And again, at least up until this point, Substack has at least it's user supported, so it's relatively free of ads.
At all. And I think Substack reminds me much more of the kind of mid 2000s blog era, where people were pseudonymously or anonymously posting long form. It was much more thoughtful. It was much more interesting. It was much more, I don't know, developed and deep. I think Twitter is just deranging by its very form. Like it's just too short. It's like being repeatedly stabbed with a small knife, you know, and Facebook is just kind of boring. And I think they basically shadow banned anyone who was talking about politics about 10 years ago, or politics in the broadest sense. You know, anyone who wasn't just posting pictures of their pets just got kind of, you know, hidden. But I would say Substack is much more interesting. Really, the best writers are on there now, at length. Yeah, no, I don't know. Scenes do move, scenes do shift, but yeah, I think you have to have a kind of stable reality principle. You have to care more about the outside, your family, you know, your real friends, looking after.
And again, that has been, you know, one of the things that we do celebrate is you're having a baby, you're buying a house, you're getting married. We have been celebrating some of these milestones and rites of passage to get people to move people away from perpetual adolescence.
To yourself and all of these basic things, like otherwise you're like the symptom of electricity. You know, you become just like this floating object on this sea of deranged, I don't know, impulses.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a strange place to be, you know, the person writing about how important, you know, writing online about how important it is to not be online and to, you know, see your friends and plug into reality. I found myself, you know, there's this meme online that, you know, the people who are most against alcohol are alcoholics. The people who are most against porn are people who can't, you know, turn off the computer because they're plugged into porn all day. You know, the people who are most kind of, you know, traditional and you're seeking to, you know, harvest their potatoes and, you know, pickle their gherkins and stuff like that are the people who really can't do that. Actually, they're both more comfortable writing about it online and saying, well, you know, the real life is about pickling gherkins, even though I don't do it myself, but I think, you know, it could be quite cool to do if other people are interested. So yeah, it is a strange. I mean, I'm talking about myself here. Obviously, I'm a trad enjoyer myself, but yeah, it is. I found that a bit of a conflict, you know, being a lover of real life, but spending 10 hours a day on the internet. You know, waiting for the day when real life is actually going to be so interesting that I'm going to do it.
Well, sure. I mean, I totally understand that. I think, you know, if you're a writer, there's something kind of compulsive and addictive about writing itself. It becomes part of a mechanism of like self-soothing, almost like it's therapeutic to write, for some people. And certainly for me, I definitely...
that whole passage that they did there was just very interesting.
Find that's the case. I mean, I'm quite interested in these modes of writing that are just almost like schizoid or just very strange, because things that disrupt, you know, I'm not saying they really have this effect on language as a whole, but things that can't just be reduced to a sort of ChatGPT 2.2 essay level writing, you know, that kind of banality of that like machine writing, which everything is becoming a bit more like, including people.
And again, this taps into the Notebook LM. Little when mostly not working, took my video that I did on Karen's talk and had Notebook LM create a podcast out of it. Then this morning I was actually listening to a Freakonomics podcast, and I was listening to that and it's like, oh, this is so the ritual and the liturgy of Notebook LM.
Like the NPC meme from a few years ago was so powerful, I think, because it really was a provocation in this sense to say to people, in what sense are you not just repeating what you've been told to say? In what way are you not just like a golem with a script in your mouth saying the right thing? And people really didn't like the NPC meme. I mean, they really tried to shut this down on Twitter and elsewhere, you know, to say that it's a far right meme and all of the things that they always say whenever anyone does anything interesting, in order to frighten people away from it. But I think because it really touched on this truth that actually everybody is becoming more and more machine-like, and repeating the things that you're supposed to say. And sure, and of course there is a kind of allure.
I thought she was dead on here, and she said it well. I listened to 2 reviews of the new Joker movie that's out, one from Damian Walter and one from Byrne Power. And I asked Byrne Power what he thought of Damian's, and Byrne commented on all the postmodernity. Well, what Damian does with his channel is he usually takes these things and looks at them through the lens of postmodernity. And I know a lot of people get triggered. I never got any postmodernity education in school, so I get a lot of my postmodernity education through Damian. And I often benefit and by some of the observations and the insights that come. And I thought I really enjoyed his treatment of this, and especially his treatment of the fantasy. Because what's interesting is that we're not only becoming more machine-like. I love the beginning of the ritual conversation with Peugeot and Vervaeke, where I might as well play it. Why do I describe it instead of just play the darn thing?
Proper part of being rational is the imperative to be more rational. Mm-hmm. So rationality is an inherently aspirational entity, which means at the heart of rationality is aspiration and transformative experience, which requires ritual, because ritual is imaginal, serious play.
It's just funny because just with that, you completely undermine the entire project of rationalism. That's true. I'd never thought about it, that because you want to be reasonable,
yes,
reason becomes aspirational, and therefore you have to kind of imagine and project yourself into that space before you enter into it, because why would you desire it if you couldn't imagine yourself in a future state where you have to move towards that future state through imagination?
And what I thought was so good about Damian's piece was how he showed the aspirational fantasy. Our movies have been showing our aspirational fantasy. I talked about the Vervaeke conversation with Coyne. What's his first name? Sean Coyne. And I played the little clip from there where he said, Hollywood just keep kicking out these dystopian pictures. Well, we're in this weird place where our fantasies are getting stranger and stranger, and our ability to aspire towards them is getting more and more powerful, and therefore more and more prone to catastrophe.
Force-fed fantasy for 20 years or more. Fantasies of muscular men in spandex and hot babes fighting evil, wearing only a swimsuit. Fantasies of boy wizards, wars among the stars, games of thrones, post-apocalypses, and blue alien avatars. Computer-generated imagery made it possible to put our wildest fantasies on our screens, and we've been gorging on fantasy ever since. Then along came Todd Phillips and Joaquin Phoenix to smuggle into a superhero franchise at the heart of our fantasies, a nugget of pure anti-fantasy. The Joker movies aren't realism. Sadly, the fate of the mentally ill in our society is sadder even than the life of Arthur Fleck. Instead, Joker and its sequels are stories about fantasy, how fantasy holds us in a powerful grip, and the cost of living in our fantasies. And like the collision of matter and antimatter, the collision of our fantasy-soaked culture with this anti-fantasy movie is explosive. Joker isn't a Joker movie. Gen Xers and millennials who remember Vertigo Comics will know what Joker is. The Vertigo Comics imprint was where DC let its best creators mess with its IP to remix Batman, Superman, and the rest of the Pantheon. Vertigo was formed after the success first of Alan Moore's Watchmen, 1985, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, 1986, and Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, 1988. Moore, Miller, Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, Garth Ennis, Warren Ellis, and a coterie of writers under editor Karen Berger rewrote the DC Pantheon and created new characters. Many of the best Vertigo-style comics deconstructed the fantasies of superhero comics into sophisticated anti-fantasies that confronted readers with what our fantasies really are.
Yeah, you went through that section. I've got a lot of thoughts about this postmodernist idea about mental illness because, again, part of what comes after postmodernity is an attempt at kind of a foundationalism again, but it's not a pure materialist foundationalism. It's the entire Jordan Peterson project and John Vervaeke project in many ways are attempts at a new foundationalism, but something that's a lot more sophisticated and a lot more mythological than the modernist foundationalism.
An excitement of the internet and of engaging with strangers in crazy ways, and but I mean maybe cancellation in that sense is like a gift from God. It's like you can't participate in.
Now, Alex just mentions her previous cancellations, which I knew almost nothing about, and then I tried to do a little bit of research on. It was like, wow, this would require a whole lot more research than I have time to do in order to actually get a video out today. So I just take her at her word, and I'm sure, given who many of you are, very online people, you know about this stuff. I don't. You can, of course, share your feelings or thoughts in the comments section. But so many of her observations in this video I found to be profound and insightful and really helpful for me.
Anymore, you have to get off. There's something. It's very double-edged. What cancellation is actually.
Well, you've been through the whole ringer of cancellation because people are talking about cancellation very lightly, like some people told me like they're trying to cancel you, and I'm like, what does that mean? Oh, your Substack subscribers will go down. I'm like, yeah, well, that's not actually cancellation, total obliteration, like see Nina Power. That's exactly I think that's the extreme case of it. I think the moral of the story is that you're not only surviving, you're thriving in many ways, and you just got married, which is again, congratulations. It's wonderful, and there is life after you hold your ground with even the most psychopathic.
And part of this, I don't know how old Nina Power is, but just getting married. How long did that take? I'm not trying to criticize or anything, but so much of what we the internet seems to be this alternative derailing reality that sort of, this is a deep theme in Grim Grizz's channel with himself as a cautionary tale, where he took himself sort of out of the mainstream of common human development, and of course for many women, they don't have a decade to lose. So it's very interesting watching the creation of the online space, and very quickly early on, even just with the development of the term cyberspace, we instinctively had a sense that this was an alternative reality that we are living. And now it is an alternative reality that many of us are participating in, while we're also in this other reality. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to figure out, okay, what's the relationship between these two worlds?
Of bullies online. And really, yours is an extreme case because, you got roped into all sorts of things. I'll post it. We're not going to discuss it again because I'm sure you're enough of chatting about this case and this person. But yeah, it's really tough. You're at the end of a big road, a very complex, meandering, and very stressful place, and you are fine. And people can be fine even after this happens. And I think, not to be cliche and weird about it, but I think you've learned a lot about, the nature of your strength and humanity, friendship, who's going to be. I think a lot of people don't get to learn these lessons because they're never in a place where there's so much pressure is applied to them. Yours is a modern type of pressure, very strange, very quirk of the internet type of situation. But in a way, it's a strangely spiritually privileged position to actually, see who your friends are, go through, the dark night of the soul in such a way, and to see yourself coming out of it and being fine in a way, not always, but in many ways, fine and kind of spiritually, strong.
Oh, totally. And there's this really interesting thing someone told me about a few years ago that the Sufis used to do. It's a very obscure kind of esoteric practice called something like malamatia, which is basically where you would bring public disgrace upon yourself deliberately, that you would basically ruin your own reputation in the world, so that you would precisely have this kind of spiritual experience of this kind of removal of the world, the disavowal of the world, like the
I found this comment, so I'd never heard of this thing, but it reminded me to a degree of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly says, don't perform your righteousness before men. Blessed are you, when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And whereas this isn't necessarily a Christian discipline as such per se, but one of the big themes of the Sermon on the Mount is be careful about how high you hold your reputation. And of course, Jesus, who is the ideal for Christians, has a terrible reputation among all of the people who decide that he should be dead. And again, the point that I make often, in a very bloody, vicious culture war that they are fighting, the only things that, let's say, the Judeans who are in favor of the Roman way and the Judeans who see the Roman way as a complete contamination of their way of life, the only thing that they can agree on is that Jesus should die.
The destruction of status and all of these sorts of things that people do care about. And there's a very complex relationship between reputation, I think, and also having enough money. I mean, if you have a family, for example, of course, then you need money to look after your family. So people are very beholden to these material things for good reason. And the reason why, therefore, cancellation threats work is because the threat of economic deprivation is a real one for a lot of people. Very few people are able or willing to say, I'm going to lose everything in the name of principles. I'm going to take a principled stand because I care about this issue. And
because in many of our structures, reputation is basically your future. So
it might mean that I lose all my friends and somewhere to live, right? That's a very extreme thing to do. Not many people are going to be able to do that. But precisely the point of this kind of spiritual practice was to work out those things, to work out what it was that you valued, like your relation to God, your who your friends were, what you cared about, who you are both in the world and not of the world in a way. And yeah, I agree with you that it's a kind of spiritually privileged position, even though it's very strange and modern. It's also very old fashioned. There's many discussions in the Bible about being hated, being denounced, if you like, and yeah, that kind of tension between the worldly, these preoccupations of the world, and a sort of spiritual protection or a spiritual sense of self or relation to God that is not that isn't worldly, that can't be reduced to these sorts of questions of status and material wealth. So yeah, it's it's amazing. I every time I'm cancelled, I never feel freer.
Yeah, you come back stronger. Yeah, it is
Absolutely.
interesting. It is interesting to see that even people who actually do have the so-called FU money and tenure and things like that, a lot of them still won't do what you did, and risk and expose themselves. And even though we know this from a lot of secret conversations that a lot of them have, that they agree with a lot of so-called heterodox positions, but they wouldn't say so. Because I think, the status, maybe because we're kind of in a post scarcity in terms of shelter, home, a lot of people, very few intellectuals are scared that they won't have food on the table. Status really is kind of the last thing, the last man standing. And I think it probably looms larger than it used to because, Maslow's pyramid's pretty much taken care of, but the perspective of your peers on your reputation and your legacy and all this type of stuff, and if you have a family, also how society views them is very important. And I think it's gotten much scarier than it used to be, even though the consequences of being ostracized aren't as grave as as being just thrown to the wolves at the gates of the city. But still, the reason for people committing suicide, the reason for people just completely checking out, retreating into addictions and all sorts of things. So I think, a new philosophy, a new perspective on status is probably something that needs to be digested somehow. I mean, I know Linda Bouton wrote that, pop philosophy, status anxiety.
And again, Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus talks about when you go into the room, take the lowest seat. And again, he was living in a society which was not supposedly egalitarian, but one that very much looked at status.
Society book, and I thought it was really interesting. But it didn't make me feel much more relaxed. I feel like a stronger medicine is required to calm people's status anxieties. But yeah, it's
Well, I think in the absence of any kind of religion, it's what's left, basically. I agree with you that, if people have their basic needs covered, and if we no longer care about things like character or, I don't know how to put it, an image of the self that is more complicated, like this kind of, there isn't much room for moral ambiguity or for
some
people to
of
improve their own lives, or we've got rid of things like forgiveness and atonement. It's all just reputation management or status. And then you live in a world that's full of secrets, first of all, and you live in a world that's very fearful. And this is really about fear, because what people are being manipulated really is at that level of fear, which is a very deep animal instinct. And if you can't overcome fear, you're basically controllable. Someone else can control you because they will make you afraid, and then you're their puppet. So I think if you're not afraid of anybody or anything, or of losing whatever, if you
And again, the New Testament, Jesus talks about this point over and over and over again. Do not feel the one who can kill your body or starve you or anything else. Look at the birds of the air. I mean, Jesus talks about these issues, and now they didn't go into, I don't know where she's at, but it sounded like she's been on a journey towards Christianity, and the more this conversation develops, the more they talk about Christianity. But again, this point about status and fear, true love casts out fear. And the whole story of Jesus is that he's not afraid of his enemies who are seeking to kill him. There are multiple attempts on Jesus' life throughout the gospel. And in the end, they take his life.
You always have a sense of security, like in yourself, right? Or you think, okay.
See, and there's the secret sacred self. You have and I don't want to lean too hard in that, because it is I understand how that's the way we point, but again, I think in the gospel, your sense of security has to come from who you are in Christ, and in the belief that though they can take your body, do not fear the one who can take your body, fear the one who can damn your soul, basically, the text says.
I'm bankrupt and I've lost my job, but there are people who would never let me starve, right? I'm always going to be able to eat. Someone will always put me up, or I'll have somewhere to live, or, you know, that if you have a kind of security in yourself, like thinking for yourself, I can think freely. I'm not beholden.
Many people can't think freely. Many people can't go all the way back to Alan Jacobs' book that I dealt with early on in this video journey, How to Think. We don't think for ourselves. The spirits are thinking and acting through us. We have to discern the spirits. We have to find agency. And again, also to C.S. Lewis, don't try to be original. Sort of master the spirits that are speaking through the literary. And as you do this, what you will discover is that what you will grow in is agency. And then you will actually probably be able to contribute something of worth. Human beings are, what was I listening to? I think that was in the Peugeot Ben Shapiro conversation. Or was it something else? I don't remember. Human beings are not made to. We are not originators. Maybe it was. Oh, it was Peugeot on Lucifer, where human beings. Basically, one of the things I got from Peugeot's video on Lucifer is that we basically are created to reflect the light, and I can probably find it
for them. So you can imagine now the morning star becoming arrogant and thinking that the light that it has is only its light, and that it has all the light, and is stronger than the sun. But then it's a form of hubris, because of course, once the sun appears, Venus disappears, right? Once the sun appears in the heaven, the morning star vanishes. You can't see it anymore because the sun is too bright. And so you can understand how this is also an image of how, without, how can I say this, that if a secondary authority, if any being tries to take the authority they have or the power they have for themselves, then ultimately they are eclipsed by the thing that causes them, right?
And then this is the idea of, let's see, where are we here? This is the idea of that when we actually the degree to which we can make a contribution is the degree to which something else is flowing through us, that we are reflecting the source of the light.
I'm not afraid of what will happen if I say X and Y. And that's enormous strength that makes all of the other stuff completely irrelevant. But I do completely agree with you that we need a theory or a way of understanding how status in these games are working online in particular, or in the internet age, because it's very obvious when people come for me, what they're trying to do is reputation destruction, right? That's because that's what they care about. So you can see by their behavior that what they are interested in is controlling the narrative. To say there's one story about this person or that person, and it's the one that we're going to tell you. So it's something to do with attention. It's something to do with narrative. I mean, remember the kind of postmodern sea of stories idea. If you recall, like there was this sort of literary poetic idea that, we're all just telling stories. It's very like Jeanette Winterson or something, or, these kind of postmodern theorists. But that was sort of pluralistic in a certain way. It was like, it wasn't saying one story is better than another. And in fact, it was saying, oh, we're over these big stories. Like we're, these grand narratives of Christianity or communism or whatever. These are over. Like these are too molar. Like they're too structured, right? And we're beyond that now. And now we're in this kind of, this sea of stories. But basically what happens if you just have a sea of stories, then some people, for whatever set of pathological reasons, are going to say, no, it's my story. Like, you're never going to be able to kill that impulse to control. And I think, in a sort of era of status games, it's the people who want that kind of control that we need to understand the most. And of course, the internet is also filled with hundreds of videos about narcissism and cluster B society, and you know what I mean? Like, this is also part of the discourse, like the political discourse. And that has its pluses and minuses, and you end up with a kind of almost a sort of psychological story where everyone is trying to diagnose everyone else. And there's actually a very good Philip K. Dick novel called Clans of the Alphane Moon, where this is the world in which everybody has their mental health diagnosis. It's a very good novel, and everyone is like a clan that has its specific kind of pathology. But then it turns out that some people are not what they say they are, or not what they've been told they are, and their diagnosis is not the real one, and it's all about this sort of machinations at the level of kind of psychopathology. And I wonder if we're sort of almost post psychopathology in that Ballardian, Freudian sense, that we're in something else now, which I guess would be whether we still have an unconscious, whether there is an unconscious online, or whether there's just this static story of identity that this is who we are, and then it just depends on who can control that narrative. And we know that things like Wikipedia are completely captured. For example, people can write whatever they want pretty much about you. And how do we analyze this sort of game of reputation? It's like everybody's living in the court of Versailles at scale.
That is an amazing image. Like, everybody's living at the court of Versailles at scale.
And there's 9 billion people, many of whom are online.
Yeah, and the problem with spending more and more time online, even though there's quite a lot of upside, obviously we wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't have the cool idea to go online, is that it really does kind of make your real life a bit more fragile. I mean, in your case, you said, okay, your real life friendships and the people that admire you for your stand, and these are the things that actually sustain you and that give you that sense of security that you'll be okay, whatever happens, you'll be okay. But you see this a lot in nowadays. There's this whole narrative about distancing yourself, going no contact with your family, and a lot of these cleavages are because of ideology. About people do not like their grandma's dinner table conversation because they're a Facebook Republican instead of a Twitter whatever trans activist, whatever, pick your poison. And it really ends up making it even more fragile to exist as someone who's not like tightly ideologically stuck to the space that they're in. I think it's inherently destabilizing. Like, that's been the case for me because I was very integrated within this space, and I felt really secure in myself, and I could feel like the more I personally was drifting apart from the center of this place where my friends were and everything, the more destabilizing it was for me, because I was like, okay, I'm not on solid ground here,
And of course, in this area is what Estuary is designed to engage. Chad had a really wonderful Friday morning Randos conversation with Nate, who was at the Olympia Estuary, and he was talking Olympia conference, and he was talking about his estuary experience, and he was talking about how this fits into church for him.
Well, I've been doing the LSNAT thing, and I was trying to do with John Van Donk, and I envisioned it going a certain way. I wanted to have non-believers. I don't want to just sit around with a bunch of Christians doing navel gazing, And so I wanted to figure out how to do it and get people that don't go to church. That's what I preferred, But then I just gave it to God and said, well, I want to do this. So I reached out to my pastor and said, hey, and I kind of explained it to him, because none of these people know anything about this little corner or Paul or anything. So it's just, he said, yeah, sure, sounds like a great thing, we'll do it. And so he got like 10 people together at his house, and I did it, and the feedback was good. And that was like 6 months ago. And then the election season came up, and he was like, every year when the election comes, the church gets spun out and people get all wonky over the politics. So he's like, I think that estuary thing that you did would be good. Would you want to, lead a group and have some people do it? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. So Friday night was the night. I had 5 people at my house. He had 8 people at the group he was in, and there was another group that had 8 people.
Wow.
And I mean, it was the feedback. I got an email from him today that was like really positive feedback. We want to do this again in November the 1st. So I was like, yeah, that's good, man.
That's awesome, man. How did you approach him with the estuary idea?
Well, I've only been going to this church. Well, that's the testimony to him. I mean, you can look it up. If you look up Narrate Church in Helena, you can get a picture of, like, we meet in this theater in town, and they don't have a building. They don't want a building. They want to just stay mobile, and they want to stay in town. And their whole motto is like gather and scatter. Like, let's gather. I mean, they do cool stuff, man. They do like Ales for Trails. Like, they're a church that is really involved in the community. Ales for Trails is an event that they put on where they raise funds for all the trail system around Montana. And they have it's a beer festival. Nice. So they have, all the microbrews come, and all the microbrews, like, this is one of our best festivals, and they raised $300,000 or $400,000 for the trails, the bike trails. So I mean, it's a super healthy, cool, hip church. You know what I mean? So anybody that they're looking for people to partner with them to do outreach, and I just thought estuary would be perfect for me because I enjoy talking, to people that aren't Christians, and that part hasn't really come to fruition yet, but the whole format's there, and it's starting to be. And I've invited some friends that are non-church goers to my estuary. I'm looking forward to them showing up. But the conversations we had, man. So we had one group that my friend Bo led. And he texted me after the estuary Friday night. He's like, man, we talked about 20, we were just all over the place. We had tons of topics. How about you? And I said, no, we talked about abortion for 2 hours. And it was like, he was like, what? How did that go? And I said, it went awesome. There was people there that were for it, and there were people there that thought it should be against the law. And we talked about it for 2 hours. And when we got done, everybody hugged each other and walked out the door. And we're like, man, we want to do this again. So it was like, hallelujah. That's what this is for,
Yeah.
That was awesome.
That's an achievement.
What exactly of this is me, and what is them, and what is our allegiance? How much loyalty do I owe the ideas, the people? It is very strange. And I think of myself as someone who's sophisticated about these things because I think about them all the time. Maybe that's a problem, but it really is not. It's not easy to navigate, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think even being loyal to one person is like an adventure. It's quite difficult. It's not necessarily, you know what I mean? I mean, the idea that loyalty is some simple mechanism. It's not. It's like a daily practice or something we would want to say, and it's actually has a lot more depth. And I agree that there is this kind of, and I'm full on kind of psyop conspiracy theory about this destruction of the family stuff, by the way. I think that there really is an attempt to divide people from their
She needs to get on Grim Grizz.
relatives, in particular, in the name of creating kind of isolated individual subjects. And I think there's a very good reason, for example, like in Christianity, like honor thy father and mother was a kind of central commandment, because it's, and that would include, or especially if your parents had been bad to you. You know, it's an axiom. It's not like a choice, if you see what I mean, right? And honoring your ancestry, honoring your parents is a duty. It's not a choice. And however difficult that is, and I think this thing about everything good is difficult, whether it's having a family or staying married or friendship.
Another huge one. Everything good is difficult. It's true.
And this idea of convenience and comfort has just sort of infiltrated everything. So it's like, oh, well, my parents said something I don't like, therefore I'm going to ghost my parents. I mean, that's insane. Or the idea that if you're friends with somebody, the moment they stop being cool and fun, and maybe they have a problem in their life, or they're being denounced, and you're just like, I'm backing off. I mean, that's not friendship, right? That's just making your life easier. And I think that kind of idea of ease has just crept in everywhere, because, well, maybe because we have reached this level of comfort in our culture, and we're not used to suffering anymore, and we don't see the value or the teaching in suffering. And also, I've been thinking lately about this category of experience. I mean, when I was growing up in this like post-boomer, I don't know, long 1990s or long 60s, really, we were in, the category of experience was kind of central to becoming a person. You know, it's like, oh, you have to try these things and like go through these things, and some of them are going to be like really unpleasant. Maybe you're going to suffer. It's going to be painful to become an adult. And we definitely had that message. And I'm not sure people still have that message. And experience becomes something that's kind of highly mediated, something that is seen at a distance. You know, like experience is something you...
This is another thing that just super colonized me, because it was just so dead on.
Watch people doing on elsewhere, like on TikTok or on Netflix, or, you know, like life is very vicarious. And of course that's safe because it means that you never take any risks. But it's also like you never then develop as a person either. And you live in a kind of constant state of sort of larval being, like you're not fully formed, like you haven't experienced things that actually are required to become a character or a person. And then we're back to sort of the NPC thing again. But yeah, I think this thing about families is central, and to divide people from where they grew up and where they're from, or to say you shouldn't be interested in those things, you have to ask, like, for what reason? Like, who wants people to be this deracinated and this atomized and this isolated? Nobody who has your best interests at heart would promote that idea, I think.
Yeah.
Again, just, I mean, that section just, I thought, wow. Just, wow. She's just nailing things. I saw like stories of old on Twitter commenting that, yeah, my most recent video got a lot of negative reaction, and I'm not sure which video that was, but I suspect maybe it was The Hidden Story of the Heart of Modernity. The Worst Is Yet to Come. So I started watching that, and wow, it is a powerful video.
Prospect of taking a future that will end the Fremen. This video is best experienced on Nebula.
Okay, let's have him start here.
When Paul Atreides drinks the water of life, he sees a future that will end the Fremen culture as it has existed for thousands of years, and submits himself to it.
I'm pointing the way!
The Osage bury their traditions, They know their children will grow up in a different world and speak a different language. As they look at efficient pulses proving it is possible to split the atom, Oppenheimer and every other physicist in the world instantly understand what the discovery will eventually lead to. There has been an awakening within our collective unconsciousness, a sullen awareness that has been rising along the edges, and that is now slowly bleeding through, expressing itself in our cinema, like a stained mirror or a vintage lens, struggling to bring its reflection in focus and create a clear thought out of foreboding emotion, a feeling of entrapment, inevitability, of being powerless in the face of what we fear is to come, transformation, fragmentation, a movement away from unity. King Viserys inherited his throne after an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity, a golden age that he strove to uphold. Logan Roy too established an empire that became a source of stability for many decades, but now, weary with age and sickness, and ready for a successor, the lineage, it seems, is about to break, and the entire kingdoms are on the verge of falling apart.
The crown cannot stand strong if the House of the Dragon remains divided.
Johnny's Motor Club, while not being made up of saints by any means, was held together for a long time by a certain code of conduct, a code of honor that allowed the bike riders to become a brotherhood.
Yeah, you and me, kid.
But over the years, the club transformed, the code deteriorated, and the time of honor and brotherhood became a painfully distant memory.
That was the end of the golden age of motorcycles.
Kingdoms are no longer passed on. Realms of existence are no longer preserved. They are broken down, atomized into disparate pieces by that intangible force, that feared prophecy of rising chaos and inevitable disorder, that turns a king's wisdom into an old man's folly, and that makes it seemingly impossible to draw a sacred boundary around that which we long to maintain.
I just put the link below. The whole video is outstanding. This is one of the best things I've seen him do. But it's interesting because, of course, Nina Power on one hand is talking about the fact that we are slowly being seduced by the machine. Brave New World, in some ways, had it more right than 1984, and sort of the strangulation of the family, not by overt attacks, but by making the family seem too idealistic, too strenuous, too difficult. And yeah. And then the strangulation of that, and then the seduction into the machine, because the machine is easy, the ritual is clean and pure, and the narrative, and what Nina Power said here in terms of, yeah, and she's younger than I am. Yeah, when we were raised, we were told, life is hard, things aren't fair. That's the way the world is. And then noting that we're talking in our estuary meeting on Sunday, how on one hand we've got this anxiety about trauma. We've got to purify. I think, well, it's in this video. I should jump to that place.
I think the point that you make about everything that's worthwhile is hard. I think people just don't like hard anymore, and I do feel like it's a revealed preference. The constant refrain of if you think you're enlightened, just go to dinner at your parents' house on Christmas, and you'll see that you're not actually so enlightened. There's just obvious frictions between generations, especially nowadays when the jump between generations and the mentalities and everything, and the exposure to different materials, whatever cultural and other, is really intense. So,
and when she starts talking about this, I was thinking about the Friday question and answer when I was asked if someone time traveled here from the 1920s, what is the first thing that they would notice? And I talked about the church in my grandparents' age, and then the church in my age, and just how that transformation has happened.
People really can have all sorts of strange ideologies, which just wasn't the case, a few generations ago. Like the difference between mentality.
They had strange ideologies too, but
between my grandmother's mother and her were minimal. They were very religious. They did not know much about anything. They probably had read some prayer books and knew of gossip around town, but that was pretty much it. But the difference between her and her daughter, my mother, was huge already. Like, my mother was kind of a child of the 60s, and even in Romania that meant quite a lot. It was a huge shift, huge transformation between my mother and I. It's just absolutely incomprehensible. And now I think, what you've been saying about experience, I think about that so much now because, I have small children. And we really do live, even here in Eastern Europe, safetyism. It's all about, reducing trauma, gentle parenting. Maybe it's just, this kind of betraying my class. I'm sure there's a lot of, social classes where gentle parenting is not even on the menu. It's much more relaxed in terms of that. But there's this ominous feeling that, experience is good in the abstract, but God forbid you give your child a negative experience, because it's going to imprint on them in a terrible way. And then, this is probably also kind of a millennial fixation. Everyone thinks they've been traumatized by their parents. You don't want to be the parent that traumatizes. And then, it's just, that's the anxiety in the air, is that either you will traumatize your child or you will expose them to some sort of unsafe situation. They will die or something. Like, the idea of a child dying moved in, a few generations here from, 2 out of 8 will die. It wasn't whatever, it was tragic and terrible, but it was something that, you accepted, you digested it, and you moved on to something that is just, incomprehensible. You will do anything possible to avoid the situation. And if you don't do anything possible, you will feel terribly anxious and destroy yourself mentally because you weren't there. I think this is a really big driver of people having fewer children or no children at all. Like, it's a huge, huge pressure. It's a huge pressure. The just safetyism in general, kids not being able to, just be left out of the house to, go do their own childish things. It's a very... it's a weird place to be in, and I think it's if there is something that we can do to make things more natal, to encourage people, is to relax this kind of cloud of anxiety that just hovers over the whole act of producing new people.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree, and it's the really tragic thing is if we try to live in a culture that is post-tragic, it's actually the most tragic culture of all, and actually increasing these concerns around safety actually makes things really unsafe, and we saw this in COVID. Like, the restrictions were often much more damaging than the thing that they were supposed to prevent, if you see what I mean. Like, so there is a danger of safetyism, like safetyism, or this concern with comfort and protection and avoiding trauma and all these things actually generates more trauma, because then you create human beings who are absolutely incapable of dealing with even the tiniest thing, which is
and again, this goes back to Peterson. You don't make people more safe. You need to make people more brave. And of course, there's the right amount of trauma, and the right person brings them to excel. Another person, it might debilitate them. And you're not going to calibrate this trauma on anything above an individual scale. But yet, as a culture, so many of these traumas are now mass traumas.
Terrible tragedy, right? Like, if people have no way of navigating a world which will be unpleasant, difficult, awkward, not to mention potentially dangerous, if they don't understand, what danger is, and that's going to generate more danger somehow, like more more brutality. And I think the sort of mantras that we grew up with, like life's not fair, for example, like this was a constant. I don't know if parents still say this, but this was like a good thing to hear, right? Life's not fair. Okay. You know, you can't always get your own way, like bad things happen. Good, you know, these are like quite good mantras. Yeah, and you're just going to end up with a kind of a sort of zero-sum trauma game where people are like, no, but my trauma is bigger than your trauma. Like, you have to listen to me. Like, and this whole victim culture is like, this is what was left over from Christianity, is the idea of victimhood. But the solution that Christianity proposes, which is, no, you're not the greatest victim, right? You're not without sin, and you are both a perpetrator and a victim, right? Because you can both be transgressed against and you can transgress, which is what it means to be a human being. You will always hurt people, you will always be hurt, all the time, actually, on a low level, and sometimes on a larger level, but you are not the greatest victim. And if you get rid of that idea of Christ as the bearer of victimhood, then you end up with people trying to fill in that slot and be like, no, it's me. Like, I'm the biggest victim. Give me all your time and attention. And I think, we definitely see that playing out. So, I think to go back to your question about the status, like, how do we make these things kind of, you know, desirable again, right? Like, how do we say to people, don't be afraid, you know, don't be afraid to have children, don't be afraid to experience the world, including its, you know, its positive and its negative dimensions.
More than just how do we say. I mean, this is a point I make often. People are like, well, pastor, well, if you tell people because you're a pastor, then they'll believe you. And it's like, you're laughably naive about the status of religion and church in the world today. Again, for me, a lot of this boils down to faith and trust. And I can speak out of Christianity because obviously that's the only religion I know from the inside. First question and answer over the Heidelberg Catechism. What is my only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has freed me from the tyranny of the devil. This is a freeing, and of course the promise of the resurrection is a tremendous freeing, because part of what happens in a secular age is everything is brought in close. And now suddenly I have a bucket list. I have to get everything between 0 and 80 or 90. And I have to do all of these things or I'll never get them done. The tyranny of experience means that I have to have all of these experiences if I'm going to live life to the fullest. But the irony, of course, is that you can't put time in a bottle. You can't freeze things. And so, okay, so you've had this. So where is the final source of satisfaction? Is it having had all of these experiences? Is it leaving many children behind you, sort of a patriarchal from the Old Testament, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Abraham, who will I leave my things to if I have no heir? Maybe I'll have to leave them to my servant. Humanity has tried time and time again. Part of the freedom of the resurrection is that not only does it talk about life after death, which many other religions do, but it talks about embodied life beyond the grave. That is the point of the resurrection. And the point of the resurrection is to point us to not only give our lives here and now to, okay, I'm going to take the risk of being married. I'm going to take the risk of having children. I am going to take the risk of loving my neighbor all the way up to and including my enemy. I am going to take the risk of losing my status. I'm going to take the risk of on and on and on and on and on. I've only covered 35 minutes of this hour and 10-minute video, but like I said, this was one of the best conversations that I've heard certainly this week and for a while. So I don't know Alex or the podcast, and I haven't really used much of her stuff, so I don't want to just go. I don't want to have her have the sense that I basically am ripping off her great content. I hope she has the sense that I am sharing her content, and hopefully if we share, part of the economics of the corner has been if we share each other's work, all of the boats rise, because people can know more good channels and where to get more wisdom. So I think I'll leave it here. I was gonna look at the Friday question and answer, but basically the same point that I made, that my grandparents lived in a siloed, enclosed world where their church was the borders, and in my parents' age, those borders opened up, and those borders have continued to open. And in some ways, a lot of the faith of my grandparents was in the investment in the walls of their community, in their early 20th century, late 19th century Benedict option. And the radio, newspaper, television, cable television, internet has just exploded those walls. And now we do live in a brave new world, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate it. So again, there was just a really wonderful group of videos that I've mentioned here. I don't know if I'll come back to some of them, but really good and really worth your time. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.